Why are so many believers frustrated or depressed? What happened to the good news of Christianity? We present eye-opening realities that transform the struggle to the place where Jesus said, "Are you tired, worn out, burnt out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace." Well, welcome to the show again. This is the next segment on the Rest of the Gospel podcast, where we reveal how to just enjoy being a Christian. And the title of this one is, Are You on the Wrong Side of Grace? I'm John Beckman, and on the other side is David Lee Thomas. And I'll start off with the biggest question that I've been asked about our podcast so far. You're never going to believe it, is who is Dave Thomas? Isn't he that guy from Wendy's that died?
Oh, yeah, that's what someone asked.
More than one person asked. They thought you were the CEO that is no longer alive.
So who is Dave Thomas? Is that a real question, or is this a rhetorical question?
Well, I guess the listeners are just curious if we're professional Christians, if we have any kind of credentials.
I don't have any credentials. I've had the opportunity to get credentials on many occasions, and I have not gotten them on purpose.
Okay. Well, I do have some education in this, but I never tell anyone because I think that they will prejudge me. So I prefer to just remain anonymous. Well, I'll just title our next podcast, Are You on the Wrong Side of Grace? And try to explain what I think that means.
Yeah, you're going to have to explain that to me, John.
Well, in order to start off, I can go to one of the most popular Bible verses about grace, and this is in Ephesians 2:8 and following, and it says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that is not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, that no one should boast." Now, I'll continue the next verse later, but just to grasp that we are the only way anyone can be saved. And what does being saved even mean? It means that God offers us salvation. Another way of looking at that is when you go to the junkyard, you could buy a car and it's a salvaged car. It's still there, but it needs some fixing up. Well, the salvaging of our souls and our whole lives is based on grace. We've been purchased by the Son of God, Jesus, and there's no other way. And some people might think that's not fair, but actually it's available to anyone, so it's more than fair. But it's by this grace that we are not just given a hall pass to heaven, but we're connected with our divine creator. And some people try to be good in order to make that happen, but the scriptures say that it is not a result of your works and your efforts to be good, or else you could brag about it. So we have to rely on this thing that God calls grace, or else we're on the wrong side of grace. Just like when people in power make a wrong decision, they say, you're on the wrong side of history because you're not progressive. Well, this is what makes us be on the wrong side of grace. Our attempts to do it another way is the bottom line, but I'd like to go into more details too. You could be, in one sense, an outsider, an unbeliever, unconnected with the saving power of God. That's one way to be on the wrong side of grace. But the other way is You could be very familiar with Christian teaching, but in endeavoring to depend on your ability to make a relationship with God. And I think that's where many are. And even worse is the hybrid that has been accepted. And that is, they say that you can accept God through grace for your initial salvation, but then revert to works to maintain salvation. That's the real trickery that goes on here that will definitely make you not rest in God's grace. It'll freak you out, and you'll just be stressed out and in a frenzy drama for the rest of your life. And so then, because I used to be one of those people, and I rarely had peace. I was always trying to do more things for God to make sure that we were on good terms. That's not how it works. The Bible says God is love. It doesn't say he has love. So you can't do one thing or 100 things good to make that love change. And you can't do 1 or 100 things bad to make God's love change. So because of grace, our relationship with God is never at risk. And that produces rest.
Because, I would say this, in Hebrews, it talks about we can't put Jesus back on the cross again.
Right.
So with that mentality, that's exactly what you're doing. You're saying that you're somehow falling in and out of that, and Christ has to keep being put on the cross over and over and over.
Good point. I remember when I was young, I was a reckless driver, and I got put on what's called high-risk insurance, and until I behaved and drove better and could prove that I was a good driver. That's called being an at-risk driver. When you're a Christian and you base your whole love affair with God on what Jesus has done for you, your relationship is never at risk because he didn't fail. And if you think that something is amiss, it's because you're looking at your ability. And I'm not saying that behaving is a bad thing, but it is when you make your salvation revolve around your efforts. And that's the trap that we're trying to help people escape. But the natural mind says, well, then you can just go out and do anything you want. If the good news is so good, we're just going to abuse the privilege. Not if you got God's personality inside of you.
It's the goodness of God. It's loving kindness that leads men to repentance.
The relationship is not just it's not just initiated by grace, and which is the power of God, but it is maintained by God's power of grace. Yeah, he wouldn't go through all the trouble that he did just to revoke his privileges. It says in the Bible that the callings and the gifts of God are irrevocable. I was so convinced that because I knew what was right and I did the wrong thing, that I had disqualified myself from God's blessings. And I lived condemned for more than a couple years. And there's a term that is in the Bible that is sometimes described for people like that, like me, and it's called fallen from grace. However, that notion, whereas it's understood to mean that you did something wrong and now you've been knocked off that good standing with God, you've fallen from grace, that's not what it means. What it means in the biblical sense is you started out living by grace, but then you reverted back to your own ability, your efforts, and your works to try to say that now God will be happy with me because I'm working harder for him. That's actually what it means when it says fallen from grace, because you've fallen from the grace life into a life of works. It has nothing to do with a moral failure. It all revolves around and depends upon God's faithfulness. And that's always in effect.
There has to be the constant of grace. There has to be the constant of love.
When I first became a Christian, I must have heard 50 sermons about you're saved by grace. And I was so annoyed because I was like, okay, I get it. Now tell me more of what else. There's a whole bunch more in the Bible I want to know. Come to find out, that preacher was right. Everything is hinging on God's grace. Your whole Christian life, and maybe we should talk about what grace is, because some people just think it means you're forgiven. What else is it?
I looked up grace. It said the loving mercies of God.
And God doesn't just love us in the afterlife. He loves us enough now. You would think that if grace brings us to eternity, that we could also use it in the meantime before we're there.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Christians understand that that's available.
No, I mean, it's because they want to push everything into heaven, into the future. There's just not a faith to believe that grace is here today. And that grace is here right now on this podcast. To everybody who's listening, it's here right now.
It's a supernatural enablement that causes you to become everything that God wills in your life. So now you see how more important grace is. Grace teaches us to say no to ungodliness, but it is an empowerment that steers you as God leads. And so grace is an empowerment. It's an empowerment that we all need and we cannot live without. It's not like, oh, I read about love, I read about faith, I read about grace, and now I'm moving on to something else. No, grace is the very essence of God in you. Even Jesus is described as someone who was full of grace and truth. And so if Jesus needs it, I know we do.
God pursued us. There's not, God has pursued this relationship with us. We didn't pursue it. We didn't start it. It says that no man is righteous, no, not one, and there's no man that seeks after God. There's not one. So it is God that has initiated this love relationship, and He's the one that will finish it too. He carries us all the way through. You just think about Paul. Like, there was no preacher to Paul whenever he got blind, and that was the Lord trying to get a hold of Paul. God was already on the scene preparing the heart of Paul for Ananias, who was going to, pray for him, and his eyes were going to be open. So God prepared the heart of Paul for Ananias to tell him about the gospel.
Everybody listening to my voice can have grace in their particular occupation. You could even be a housewife. You got a grace to raise up your children that other people wouldn't be able to because they don't have that grace. The grace that God gives abounds, and it's available in all facets of life for us to use. And we need to be aware of it, because the way to be on the wrong side of grace is to be unaware of it and to be an unbeliever. Like, you could say you're a Christian, but you could also not be acting in the grace mode that God has given you the supernatural enablement to do. You might say, I'm shy. I don't really want to tell people about God's love because I'm an introvert. Well, that's because you're not aware that God gives you the tongue of the learned and the grace to tell people.
There is a rest in just operating in grace. I was raised in a traditional Pentecostal church, and that's how everything was. It was, what have you done today? What have you done wrong? And it's always about what's wrong, and then how many souls have you won? There's something about walking in grace that we're just doing what the Lord has empowered us to do, has has called us to do. We're not trying to get outside of that. Mm-hmm. And we're just resting in Him that He will accomplish everything. It's just Him.
Yeah, and it's very liberating. You may have a mountain of responsibilities you feel like you need to do. Why not just pause right now and say, God, how about you help me see the grace that you're giving me just today to do the first step towards what you want to see happen? I mean, wouldn't that take the stress out of your whole week?
And now you know the rest of the gospel. You can find us every week here on Apple, Amazon, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcasts. This is John and Dave signing off, so join us next time.